Tonight's program is a part of our Catskill Region Leadership Institute. This program was funded through a grant with the Land Trust Alliance, and the goal of the grant was to provide programming for local leaders so they could gain an understanding of the opportunities associated with the protected and public lands in the Catskill Park. And so we thought, what better topic to discuss with our public than tonight's topic, which we are going to have 4 speakers. We'll start with Bill Rudge, who's from DEC, and he's going to give us an overview of the DEC lands and what's happening on them and their public uses. Then we'll move on to Paul Lentz, who is with New York City DEP, and he will share the same thing but with information about the DEP lands. Then we will have Brian Zweig, so sorry. Brian has been hired by a partnership between the Catskill Center, the Catskill Mountain Keeper, and the Catskill Heritage Alliance to conduct a study. And the name of the study is Economic Valuation Study for Public Lands in the Central Catskills. So we don't quite have the results completely put together, but Brian is going to share what he can with us tonight about that study. And then we'll wrap up with Alan White, who's our Executive Director at the Catskill Center, and he is going to let us know what the next steps are in the process for this study. So I just wanted to give you an overview of who will be speaking tonight and what the order is, and while I am playing with the machine to get everybody's presentation up and running, I'll let each speaker tell a little bit more about themselves. So, we will get started, and I invite Paul up, or Bill up. I'm sorry, you guys, my brain does not work. And
how do I advance it?
Here's your remote, and it's just like your mouse on your desk. So this side will advance it. And if you need to go back, holler, and I can move it back.
Terrific. I feel like I'm preaching in the choir here, because I think everyone here probably has a pretty good understanding of the Catskill Park. But for our remote audience, which I appreciate Dave, Shannon doing taping tonight, I'll give everyone a good sense for what the Catskill Park is, how our department manages the park, and what recreational opportunities there are in the park that I think we are hoping to, expand upon some partnerships with organizations and individuals in the region to make better use of the public lands and enhance people's recreational opportunities in the park. And there's some great examples of things that have already occurred or are underway that I think we can build upon. So as a starting point, I like to give everyone a better understanding of what the Catskill Park is. And at the core of the Catskill Park is the public land that has been slowly but surely acquired over time within the boundaries of the blue line of the Catskill Park. And that's the Catskill Forest Preserve, which was established in 1885 and later incorporated into the state's constitution. The critical language is right here. It's actually a very short, succinct couple of sentences here. The lands of the state, now owned or hereafter acquired, constituting the forest preserve, is now fixed by law, shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, public or private, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. So, you know, the essence of this forever wild land is that this land was preserved for all New Yorkers for a variety of reasons, but specifically it's not to be used for commercial gain by the selling of the timber or the mining of the mineral resources on it. Instead, it's supposed to serve maybe what some would consider a higher purpose to then benefit the natural resources, the quality of life, and the recreational opportunities the region has to offer. How large is this park? It's a little over 1,000 square miles and encompasses 705,500 acres. And it includes parts of Greene, Delaware, Sullivan, and Ulster County. A total of 24 towns lie within the park, or portions thereof. To get a better understanding of the Catskill Park, we have developed some information, including a kiosk that we will talk about a little later in my presentation. But this is a panel off that kiosk that provides a sense for the park. It's a mixture of public and private land. In more recent years, it's become a mix of public, private, and city watershed land, which is another variety of public land that Paul Enns will talk about later. But that's really helped to further advance the identity of the park as this park that's critical to many New Yorkers as a source of water for drinking and other uses. The breakdown of land within the park, as you can see, the largest ownership now is in public ownership. It's over 50% publicly owned. The vast majority of that being New York State Forest Preserve land. Another significant portion now being New York City watershed land. Some other entities, municipal parks, county lands, town lands, land trusts in the public sector. And then, still a significant portion of private land. Ulster County is the county with the most forest preserve land, I've forgotten the scale now of the lighting here, but well over 100,000 acres in Ulster County. Here's a general map of the park showing that mix of public and private land. The darkest green is wilderness lands in the park, and the light green is wild forest, and those are the two classifications of forest preserve that make up most of the public land within the park. There are 5 wilderness units in the park comprising 143,000 acres, 14 wild forest units comprising 130,000 acres. We have 11 intensive use areas, including the Bel Air Ski Center and the campgrounds within the park. We have 4 primitive corridors and some administrative units that make out the balance of the lands in the park. There are a tremendous amount of recreational facilities within the park, including 7 campgrounds with 738 campsites, unlimited private camping. Most of the forest preserve lands are open to primitive camping, backpacking. We have a couple of day use areas in the park and hundreds of miles of recreational trails. And they include, in the highlight, our 7 developed campgrounds these are campgrounds where we provide a fire ring and a picnic table, in a defined area for you to set up your site, bathrooms, shower facilities. Most of our campgrounds are on water bodies, like this one here at Mongut Pond Campground, where we have a public beach, we have boating facilities. The whole Catskill Park is laced with a network of over 300 miles of hiking trails, many of which are devoted specifically to hiking, and most of them ascend the high peaks of the Catskills. So most of those peaks can be climbed via a marked hiking trail, and then in addition we have a number of trailless peaks that offer a different kind of experience, and it's a very popular experience for people to bushwhack in the Catskills to the summits. There are a number of cultural resources, including this is an example of the John Burroughs Memorial Forest in the Shandaken Wild Forest. A number of fire towers, 5 have been rehabilitated within the Catskill Park, and this is a great example of a public-private partnership where the department has worked with a number of organizations, including the Catskill Center, to rehabilitate the fire towers and open them to public use, and they're an extremely popular destination for the hiking community. We have a number of backcountry lean-tos that provide a unique camping experience. We have some world-class fishing opportunities throughout the Catskill Park, including 21 developed fishing access sites and over 60 miles of fishing rights on private lands where we've acquired the right for the public to go in on those private lands and fish the streams or other water bodies that occur on those private lands, and those are all posted with a sign like this. We have a number of recreational boating opportunities, including some of the major streams in the Catskills, like here, the East Branch of the Delaware River. The Bel Air Mountain Ski Center is probably the most highly developed recreational opportunity we have in the park, and it accounts for probably most of the public use of the park lands. One thing I always like to bring into the discussion like this is that we as the state of New York does pay local property taxes back to municipalities. So you can see that each county we pay a significant amount culminating in Ulster County, where we have the greatest amount of public land, where we pay over almost $7 million in property taxes on the public land within the Catskills. And all total, we pay, in 2010, we paid nearly $12 million in property taxes. How do we manage the park? Well, obviously the Constitution provides the overview, and then since the constitutional provision, we've developed a master plan that guides our management of the park. We then, through this master plan, which designated management units, we have developed unit management plans for each property, and of course we have environmental conservation law and rules and regulations we've developed over the years to govern how the public uses the public land within the Catskills. Again, one of the most critical elements to our management of the park, and I see this only getting broader and more instrumental in the future and more effective, is our partnerships with outside organizations. We have legislatively, in recent years, we got this Adopt a Natural Resource program where volunteers can adopt one of the natural resources, such as a hiking trail or a fire tower or a camping area, and they can provide on-the-ground stewardship of that resource for us. And you know, one of the most significant Adopt a Natural Resource agreements we have, in fact, is one with the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference to maintain, I think it's over 200 miles of hiking trails in the Catskills. Like I said, the agreement we have with the Catskill Center and individual organizations for the maintenance of our fire towers is another outstanding example of the positive benefits those agreements have had. Here's an example with a local community in Willowemoc, where they developed a kiosk to provide local information about the history of the area and for the Willowemoc Wild Forest. Another example of a cooperative effort was with the Catskill Center and the Friends of the Catskill Interpretive Center to develop a kiosk at the Catskill Interpretive Center site. We have an agreement with New York City DEP to help, where our staff help to provide stewardship of the city's watershed lands to enhance public access. And I'll leave Paul to talk a little bit more about that. In terms of enhancing the identity of the park, we've worked with a number of stakeholders and the Department of Transportation to come up with a Catskill Park graphic image that I think most of you, I imagine, now have seen throughout the park. We've provided this graphic image in association with every community within the park. So here's a couple of examples. We also have allowed individual towns to adopt the graphic image for their street signs, and here's an example of the street sign from the town of Shandaken who has adopted it. We've used the graphic image in association with geographic features, such as where highways cross the streams. We've used it in conjunction with directional signs. All the The theory behind this is the more opportunity we have to present a sense of the Catskill Park when people are looking for information in the park, the greater sense that they have that you're in the park. We're also developing a system of wayfinding signs for the park, and we're using the graphic image in association with those wayfinding signs. For many years, I think the public has been appropriately critical of the fact that our trailheads and other recreational opportunities were, difficult to find if you weren't familiar with the park. And so we developed this system of wayfinding signage on the primary highways that direct people to the recreational opportunities in the park. So I'm going to end my presentation there as a brief overview. This is my closing slide if anyone wants to get in touch with me or my counterpart in Region 4 Peter's. Here's our contact information. Does anyone have any questions about the park? Okay.
I'm Paul Enns with DEP out of Kingston, and I'm in the Natural Resource Division, which works on many different areas, recreation, invasive species, forestry, conservation easement stewardship, land use permits, property management, and we assist our land acquisition program with mining property. We also have a wetlands group and a fisheries group. So thank you for the invite today. We appreciate it. Always excited to talk about what we're doing with recreation, and sometimes I take it for granted that people know what we're doing, and a lot of times that's not the case. So anytime we get the opportunity to talk about it, that's great. I messed up already. Okay, so why recreation? We're DEP, the Bureau of Water Supply. We're not DEC. We're worried about getting clean water to 9 million New Yorkers. Well, we're the second largest landowner in the watershed. And in Catskill Park, we've got over 53,000 acres, and 32,000 acres of that is open for recreation. It's not such a huge percentage because a lot of that encompasses a lot of the lands right around the reservoir. If you took just the lands that we bought under the land acquisition program, the percentage of open lands is much higher than that, probably upwards of 85 or 90%. So we do believe that recreational activities are compatible with water quality. We think that we have a huge role to play in the local economy. Our lands provide destinations for tourists and recreational users, along with some of the other lands that are out there. And in our strategic plan that DEP developed, we actually have as a guiding principle expand recreational opportunities. So that's DEP's plan, and we're always measured against what are we opening. So we tend to use this a lot, but recreational users really are the eyes and ears for us. They're the first ones to give us a call if they see something that shouldn't be there. And we also, recreation-wise, deer hunting is a big tool for us to reduce negative impacts on water supply forests from deer browsing and regeneration. And there's just been various requirements for us to expand our recreation over the years. So I won't go into too many details, but way back in 1905, the Water Supply Act actually contemplated people using city land. And we had to provide public access for fishing, boating, and actually ice cutting on our reservoirs. Not too much ice cutting going on now, but as long as it was in accordance with the city rules to protect the purity of water and prevent nuisances. In 1997, there was the memorandum of agreement with the various entities, regulators. It thought of uses such as hunting, hiking, fishing, snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, and those were probably likely to be allowed. That's when that was written. Uses that were unlikely to be allowed were snowmobiling, camping, motorcycling, mountain biking, and we have done some of those in the past few years. So at that time in '97, we looked at all the potential uses and came up with a report of what we thought we could allow. And then the filtration avoidance determinations over the years, we put recreation into that, and one of the requirements for us is to keep our lands open for recreation. So over the past 5 or 6 years, we've really tried to reduce barriers to the public to access our lands. It's safe to say that the city started out slowly with recreation. We were very cautious. We are a water supply agency. The idea of people running all over our lands, scared some folks. So we started out slow. Limited deer hunting in a few places, fishing by boat and along the shorelines. That's been around for a while. 2008, we opened public access areas. That's along DEC. That allows people to use DEP lands west of Hudson without a DEP access permit. And you can hunt, hike, fish, and trap on those lands. We had hunt tags, so people that wanted to hunt on our lands had to get a separate tag. We did away with that, again, just to make it easier. And we improved our website. You can get a DEP access permit or renew your access permit or update your records. You can do all that online and instantly get your DEP access permit. We also have group access permits, which if you wanted to lead a hike, we would give the person who's the group leader an access permit, and they could take up to, I think it's 20 or 30 people on a hike. So if you want to do a mushroom hike, for example, a group leader, and then folks could go along with that. A guest pass, if you have a DEP access permit and you have somebody coming to visit you and they can't get online for some reason, we can do a guest pass. So we have maps of all our recreation areas are on the website. And this year, we revised our land use permit rules to waive fees for recreational related activities. So for example, if Woodstock wanted to build a trail, we would waive the fees for that. And that's just the website. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the opportunities. We have over 118,000 active access permits. We thought with the public access areas that we'd actually have that decrease a little bit, but folks love their DEP access permits. System-wide, almost 80,000 acres are open for recreation. That's a high percentage of eligible land, like I said. That makes up 300 individual recreation units. And over 46,000 acres west of Hudson are public access areas. So all the reservoirs are open for fishing from shore to boat. And then most of the new properties that we buy, the default is those being open as public access areas. With the exception of here in Woodstock, most of the properties are still open by entry by permit, and that's something that the town has. Most of the lands that are immediately surrounding the reservoirs, those are entry by permit, because we need a little greater control over those lands immediately around the reservoir. So we've opened some areas for bow hunting only, again, to help reduce that deer population. And there are lands like around the western shoreline of the Ashokan, narrow pieces of land that aren't conducive to fire or guns, shotguns or rifles. So to keep hunters in there, we opened it for bow hunting only. There's a few out of watershed fishing opportunities. We've got some small properties that are open along some of the tributaries to the Beaver Kill. We're issuing recreational land use permits. I'll talk about those later. And we're always open to participating in some of the local planning efforts. If a town or a group is getting together, we'd like to be at the table with them. We'd like to be able to show where our land is in case there's interest in building a trail. So we'd like to be part of that plan exercise. And we're always open to new proposals and new partnerships. So boating for fishing, we've got over 11,000 boats stored on all of the DEP reservoirs. Most of those are east of Hudson. We have to give people a DEP boat tag. And you'll see that there's actually a small percentage of boats used at any one time. So if you drive by a reservoir, you might see 4 or 5 boats there. I think there's 1,800 stored at the Ashokan Reservoir. 5, 10 maybe used on a busy day. So we haven't seen any negative water quality issues at present, but it is a large staff resource for us. We steam clean all the rowboats that are stored on our land, and then annually we check to make sure that they have valid boat tags. If they don't, we call the boat owner to try and get them to get a tag on their boat. If we call them once or twice and they still don't, we actually will remove those boats and we will auction those off at a Father's Day boat auction. So we're working on a boat management plan to think about how are we going to manage all these boats. If you've been east of Hudson and you drive around some of those reservoirs, it's a little messy. Those boat areas were developed a long time ago and kind of just evolved. We want a little greater control over where they're stored, how they're stored. Again, thinking about reducing shoreline erosion and just providing better user satisfaction for boaters. So expanded boating, has anyone canoed or kayaked on any of the reservoirs? If you haven't, you should get out there. We started that on the Cannonsville Reservoir, a 3-year pilot program that worked very well. So we expanded that to the Schoharie, Papacton, and Neversink, and last year we issued 1,000 boat tags for folks on that, and the Papacton received the most use. So about 1,000 tags. Kayaks are really the most used vessel, and we issue either 1 to 7 day tags or seasonal tags. And actually 44% of the users had the seasonal tags, so you can store your kayak or canoe on the reservoir. And in some of the sites we built little boat racks that you can use. So I'm sure that's going to expand next year as the word gets out. We did some expanded monitoring for invasive species, and we're working right now on revising our recreation rules to allow trolling motors on the Cannonsville as a pilot program. So just a little bit about the recreation-related permits that we issue. These are kind of similar to the natural resource permits that DEC does. So Creamery Pond up in Wyndham has like a soccer field or some ball fields. We issued a permit for that. DEC is doing some pheasant release and fish stocking on our lands and reservoirs. The village of Fleshmans, they lost their village park during Irene, so we gave them a permit to build a temporary park until they can rebuild that one. There's a fishing access site in Ashland. We did the Boy Scout trek last year where the Ashokan troop hiked some of our land and actually down along the aqueduct and made it all the way down to the city. It was kind of a celebration for them as being, I think they were the first Boy Scout troop in America. CWC recreational parking areas, they got a grant from DEC, and some of the local towns built little parking areas for better access. Village of Margaretville, we hosted the U.S. Adventure Racing National Championship on the Papacton last year. That was in October. We're working with the Rough Grouse Society to maybe do some habitat improvement on our properties. And then just different permits for fundraising events. The Harry Chapin Memorial Run Against Hunger is one example. So, you know, a race event and they want to cross over city land. And then some history hikes. Some of the archaeological groups east of Hudson have done walks on our land and poked around for mostly Revolutionary War type relics. So trails, this is something that we're really excited with, and we're really looking for partners to expand this. And we've got a trail with Teatown Reservation that links reservation, county, and city land. Angle Flat Preserve. We gave a land use permit to Finger Lakes Trail. We're working with the town of Andes and the Catskill Mountain Club right now to build 2 trails on city land. Those are kind of short loop trails, you know, rather than these long trails, plenty of long trails on DEC land.
Right.
So what was missing is a short trail that maybe a family could hike on. So that's what they're focused on right now. There's a trail around Lake Lenida, east of Hudson. We've got 3 snowmobile trails, and working with partners on a potential trail system in Margaretville. So designated use areas, those are just another type of use, and you've probably, most of you have been on the Ashokan Walkway. That's considered a designated use area. You can go there, you can walk, you don't need a DEP access permit, you can rollerblade, bike. So we've got a few of those down in the Kensico Dam. We opened one. Devasego Park is up in Prattsville. After the flood, they lost some public space, so we gave them a permit to maintain a place where the local folks could gather. I think that was really important for them as part of the recovery. And the Roundup Eagle viewing area is included in that. So deer hunting, I want to talk a little bit about that. Obviously, it's recreational opportunities on our land, but you know, deer hunting is a very important tool for the management of deer, and it's really, you know, one of the only viable tools at this point. So we do feel that forests provide the best land cover for water quality protection. So we did a forest management plan back in 2011, and it highlighted forest regeneration failure on many of our lands due to deer browse. So what are we doing? Again, just trying to open all the areas that are open for deer hunting. That's only effective to a point. You know, we see our lands, if it's surrounded by lands that aren't open for hunting, you know, first couple days the deer run off our land, run to other lands, and then come back. So we need to keep thinking about different ideas. Bow-only areas I talked about. We have a partnership with Westchester County, who has an adaptive deer management program on 3 of their parks. And we opened some of the city land that's adjacent to those parks. We opened that for deer hunting to participants in their program. So that's been a really good partnership, and something we hope to move forward with other partners that might be out there. We got deer management assistance permits from DEC, and that allows us, I think we got 42, call them doe tags, 42 tags that we could give to hunters so that they could harvest more does on city land. And we've given those all out, and again, that's something that we hope to build on. Managed hunts, that might be something that we wind up doing. We're trying to get something going with the Wounded Warrior program to have a managed hunt on city land. That didn't really work out, but that's something we're going to keep shooting for, and or youth hunts, something like that. So targeted areas. So we have a DEP recreation survey, and this is something that I shared with Ryan and helped him kind of get some numbers together. It's when you renew your access permit, we ask you to fill out a voluntary survey. We have a really high, something like 98% of the folks that renew their access permit fill out the survey. So 31% use city lands 1 to 5 times a year. Fishing from shore is the highest use, actually, especially east of Hudson. Then fishing by boat, and then big game hunting. Westchester County sees the most number of visits for the reservoirs and the land, Delaware, and then Ulster County. And as far as fishing, the Ashokan Reservoir had the most visits, and then the Pacton, and as I said, overall, the east of Hudson Reservoirs got the most use. So 85% of our users report that city lands are not crowded at all. And we're glad to see that 91% were very aware that our lands and reservoirs are part of a water supply system. None of them were not aware, which is a good thing. and 82% of our users all felt very safe on our land. So what we're seeing is, as we're opening more land, users are kind of scattered more so. So we haven't seen any negative impacts from that. And then I just thought I would throw in some of the other uses of city lands that folks might not be aware of. We do allow people to conduct agricultural activities on our land. We have over 70 projects right now. Most of them are for haying, but there are a few out there for livestock, row crops. We've got maple tapping, sugar maple tapping going on our land. I talked about the DEP forest management plan a little bit. We're trying to develop a pilot firewood project for folks, residential firewood, so folks can come on city lands and harvest some firewood. And bluestone mining, we're probably going to allow bluestone mining on a limited basis on a pilot project on some of our lands coming up in the future. So, you know, we've got the lands, we want to use them wisely, we want to share the resources with the community. And I think that's it. We do love our trees. And take any questions. I kind of blew through a lot of information fast, but
Did you mention your maps?
yeah, there's some maps over there of all our recreation areas. I'll leave those if you want to look at them or take them, or if you'd like more of those, we can certainly print out more. But it shows all the lands open for recreation and the types of use for, it's the entire watershed, not just within the park. And as you can see, the kind of neon green is all the public access areas. So you can see those have really grown over the last few years.
Well, what is your sense of the hunting pressure? I mean, are you seeing more people hunting on your land, or is it falling off?
It's falling off. Yeah, that's consistent with, you know, what the state and even the national level. So the deer hunting, we don't think it's an effective tool anymore, really, for reducing the deer population, unfortunately. But again, with all of our lands, we are seeing the scattered use.
Can you talk a little bit about, so you have, you know, frankly, I think the city's made pretty good progress in becoming more open to recreational uses. Do you have any kind of a budget to advertise that? Or is it very passive?
It's passive. You know, opportunities like this, our DEP recreational newsletter. I think in the next few years we want to get a little more aggressive on that, and again work with other folks maybe to tap into their outreach. So yeah, I think we could do a little bit more with that. There's some improvements we can make to our website to make it a little easier to find the areas. So you know, like with the expanded boating, we've worked with Delaware Chamber of Commerce and some others to develop the brochures. So again, you know, we've got our mission. Whenever there's partners that can help us, we certainly would like to do that. We've worked with, well, DEC's doing the new version of the Catskill map. Yep. We've shared some of that. Yeah. The Venture Out maps, New York, New Jersey Trail Conference had a map. National Geographic had a map. So we're trying to share our lands with them to get the word out. Mm-hmm.
Will you be opening the next campaign and work the boat or not?
No, I don't think that's on the horizon. I've learned to never say never, but I think the Ashokan it would almost suffer from too much use. You know, I mean, there's been some talk that maybe we just open the West Basin, or open it, but really control the number of people. But I think at this point, we just need to see how all the 4 reservoirs work out, make sure that program is safe, you know, make sure that we're not getting any invasive species into those reservoirs, and then maybe we can see. But I think if you open the Ashokan Reservoir, you'd get a lot of use, and it might be overuse.
In my lifetime, I'll use it like you want.
Yeah, no, I know, it certainly would be.
But I agree with you
nice.
as far as
Yeah. Yeah.
Too bad.
Yeah. So,
Any other questions?
anything else? Okay, I guess I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very much.
everyone.
Well, I'm Brian Zweig. I'm a consultant that's been working on a project here, and it's great to have the chance to follow Bill and Paul, because not only did they do a great job explaining information about both the park and the watershed, thanks. But they've been a big help to me in pulling all the information together, and their staffs have been a big help as well in putting the information together for the project that I've been working on for the better part of this year, which is, it's got a lot of long names here, but I'll just read them off. The Economic Valuation Study for the Public Lands in the Central Catskills, and more specifically, the economic impact and opportunities from recreational activities in the Catskills. So, again, it's been a big undertaking, which I'll explain here, and Bill and Paul and their staffs have been a big part of it. So, my background, my consulting firm is Business Opportunities Management Consulting. I work on planning and marketing primarily, including economic impact studies. Previously, I've also been involved with the Rensselaer County Legislature. I served there one term. Somebody recently asked me, you know, what made me decide, or when did I decide to get off the legislature? I said it was right after they counted the votes in 2009. Then my political career was one. I also was president of the Land Trust, and I've been on other not-for-profit boards, ag boards, stormwater conservation, and so forth. And my background is in economics and business management. The study is, I think, as Katie said earlier, is sponsored by Catskill Mountain Keeper, Catskill Heritage Alliance, and the Catskill Center. Last but not least, the Catskill Center, who's sponsoring tonight's event as well. And our objectives are really twofold. The first one is more of an informational gathering exercise in terms of estimating economic impact of outdoor recreational activities in the Central Catskills, on the surrounding communities and the communities where those recreational activities take place. And the second is, from that, we're looking to identify any unrealized or undeveloped recreational opportunities on public lands that would still be consistent with the existing land regulations for those lands. As you heard earlier, you got to see Paul talked about basically the blue area, the watershed, and Bill talked about the green area, the Catskill Park. The combined area of those two, again, there's overlap between the two, is over 1.2 million acres. So it's a very large piece of real estate that we're talking about. Primarily in Ulster, Greene, Delaware, Sullivan counties, a little bit of Schoharie. I really didn't do too much with the Schoharie portion because it's a pretty small section of the watershed, but technically a little bit of the watershed is in Schoharie County. And as Bill and Paul talked about, there's a lot of that is private land, but some of it is also owned by either DEC or DEP. So what we're trying to look at here is, with all this stuff going on, what's the impact from the economic standpoint for the communities? And we measure that typically in terms of dollars and in terms of jobs. And when you talk about economic impact, traditionally it's very much used for these big projects, whether it's a computer manufacturing plant or any type of industry that comes to a community. People want to know, how much of an impact this is going to be and how many jobs it's going to create. And, that's a way of either promoting it or, valuing it versus maybe some of the costs that the public has to bear to support those industries. Typically, it has not so much been used for more not-for-profit or recreational or other types of activities, but it's starting to be more applied to those kinds of activities because, indeed, people are recognizing that just because something is not necessarily a for-profit business doesn't mean there isn't economic activity. If people go hiking and they are, staying in an area overnight and they're using hotels and buying dinner and buying gas and buying supplies and so forth, that certainly has a positive impact on the economy of the community and the people who are selling goods and services in that community. And increasingly, those impacts are being people trying to capture what those impacts are, so that not just the for-profit businesses, but other activities can also be judged fairly in the public discourse. So, in general, economic impact is something that's an important method for justifying investments, and those can be both private sector investments or public sector investments. So that's what we're trying to get at here. Now, I just want to make this statement. The stuff that we're doing here as far as economic impact, there are other, well, I'll say is non-market benefits, and Paul certainly talked about a very important one. Drinking water, the value of drinking water, that's not what we're evaluating. It's certainly a huge positive, but that's not part of the economic impact. So whatever, whether you talk about the health benefits of clean water or clean air and so forth, those are in addition to whatever estimates that we make as far as economic impact here. And there are some people who specialize in putting together studies that try to measure how much people will pay extra to be near parkland, or how much they'll pay extra to be in an area where the water quality is good or the air quality is good and so forth. But again, that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here tonight. And obviously a big one that does get talked about with respect to the New York City water supply is how much do the taxpayers in New York City save by not having to establish a filtration facility, and by the fact that they're protecting this very pristine water source for drinking for residents in New York City. So again, these are kind of the things that are beyond the scope of what we're talking about here tonight when it comes to economic impact, but they're obviously very important as well. So how do we estimate economic impact? And well, there's different models that have been developed by economists and folks, typically at universities and so forth, to estimate economic benefit. And they look at things like, how many employees are being hired to maintain the parks or the parkland or the public lands, how many tourists come and how much money do they spend, how much do local businesses benefit from those activities and so forth. And so models are developed to try to estimate all that stuff. And the one that we use for this study is called the money generation model. It was developed at Michigan State. It's used primarily for National Park Services, so it's kind of applicable because it can evaluate things like the number of people that come in for recreational activities, how much money they spend. It also looks at park employees and park operations and how that type of spending and those employees also have a positive impact on the local economy. And we look at things, and I don't want to get, I realize I'm the guy that went to school for economics. This is probably more interesting to me than a lot of you, so I'll go over it quick. But there are things that are called direct effects, and I'll use that example as if I go and I go to a local restaurant and buy a sandwich, there's the benefit of that cost of that sandwich that goes to the business that sold me the sandwich. There's also what's called secondary effects. So the farmer that maybe sold tomatoes or lettuce to the restaurant, they get some benefit as well, as does the person that works there. When they leave the restaurant, they're spending money in the community. So there's those secondary benefits beyond just the $10 I spent for lunch, but the suppliers to that restaurant and the impact of those things and the people who are employed by that restaurant, those impacts are also important and measured and captured by these models. And the other thing to mention is when we talk about economic impact, we're not just talking about the spending. What we're trying to capture is the value added. So let's use the example of if I go and buy gas at the local gas station. If I'm spending $4 a gallon for that gas, the local impact is actually a lot less than $4 because most of that $4 goes back to Exxon or whoever, and that money is not local. So we try to capture in the models only the portion that goes to the folks that own that gas station that stays in the local community. So that's what we say value added. That's what we're trying to capture, and that's what these models have a lot of formulas and so forth to capture. So we try to estimate all the direct and the secondary effects and then calculate the amount of that that's really local in terms of the value added to the local economy, and then also the number of jobs that are associated with those activities. So it's a pretty complicated thing, and again, what we rely on is the research that's been done looking at national parks and the surveys and the studies they've done. They come up with formulas to estimate all this stuff, okay? So the models basically come up with multipliers and profiles of how people spend money. And what that allows them to do is if they know how many visitors come in, they can estimate what a typical visitor spends, how they spend it, and then how much of that actually impacts the local economy in terms of dollars in the community and jobs in the community. So the input that we have to have for these models to make this work, and this is what the information that was gathered through the course of the research we did, is the number of visitors. That's a very important piece of information. Second is the visitor lodging, and that's particularly critical because there's a big variation in how much people spend depending upon whether they're staying in a hotel, let's say, or whether they're just coming up for the day. So if I'm living in Woodstock and I go for a hike, maybe I buy some gas, maybe I buy some granola bars, maybe some water or soda or something, I'm not spending a ton of money. If I come up from New York City to go skiing maybe, and I stay overnight in a hotel, well now I'm maybe spending a couple $100 to buy the gas, to pay for the hotel, to buy dinner that night in a local restaurant. That's a lot bigger impact than if I live in Woodstock and I'm just going for a hike in the preserve. So we need to estimate the difference between how people, what kind of lodging they require, whether it be a day trip, whether it be a hotel, whether they're camping, and so forth. And then we also need to get information from the operations side in terms of how many people work for DEC in the area, how many people work for DEP, what's the total payroll, how much is spent on things like utilities and maintenance and capital expenses and so forth. So there's a lot of information along those lines that's spent because there's a lot of spending by those organizations in the community. We want to try to capture that. And then what percentage of that spending is local, and then the number of employees of those organizations. So that's the kind of information generally that we want to collect, and that was really the biggest thing because, as we're going to see here, our objective was to use available information as opposed to doing a whole bunch of surveys to try to figure all this stuff out. So if we wanted to station people, a wall of humans around the park for a year, we could count everybody coming in and count everybody going out and ask them how much they spent and so forth, and we could do that, but that would be $1 billion project, and our budget wasn't quite that large. So what we wanted to do is, to the extent possible, use as much available information that we could gather. And unfortunately, there's never been a real comprehensive estimate of recreational visitors, outdoor recreational visitors to Catskills. So there is some information available, and I think some of this Bill and Paul talked about. There's some information in the previously done Catskill Forest Preserve Public Access Plan and the Catskill Master Plan. New York City Watershed has done an economic impact assessment, and surveys were very important that Paul referenced earlier. And there was recently, this past year, some professors at SUNY New Paltz conducted an economic impact study of the Bel Air Mountain ski facility. So we used that, and then we basically just went around and contacted as many people and tried to get as much information as we could. So basically, our objective was to come up with estimates that, these are my terms, but I'll use them a lot here tonight and going forward, which is we want information that's reasonable and justifiable. So we want conservative numbers that we can basically back up. They're not going to be perfect. There's not, we're not going to have exact numbers here, but we want numbers that if people question them, we can say, look, we're not saying they're exact, but they make some sense, and we're not overly inflating our numbers, and we feel good that the numbers are realistic. And then what we want to come up with is what I would term as order of magnitude estimates of the impact. So, there's a difference between, I guess, precision, where you can come up with something to the penny, but that doesn't mean it's accurate just because it's the 4th decimal places. We want something that order of magnitude we feel is in the ballpark. And the way we do that is if we feel that all of our inputs are in the ballpark, then the model should give us reasonable estimates that are in the ballpark in terms of order of magnitude. And then once we have all the information, then we want to examine the public lands in particular, which is the main focus here, but we're also gathering information that relates to activities that take place on private land. So we're including both, but we're focusing particularly on the public lands. Again, to some extent, it's a little bit tricky to divide. If it's hunting, if the deer goes over from the public land to the private land, the deer doesn't know the difference, but the person is still hunting regardless of whether they happen to be on public land or private land. So it's kind of hard to separate the two, but we try to have a focus on the public side and then try to accumulate the total that includes both public and private. So we went out to the different organizations and looked at all the different type of outdoor recreational activities and tried to gather information. So with respect to the Catskill Park, we looked at things like hiking and hunting and camping and so forth. We went to the DEC folks, and there's pretty good information in terms of the number of people who sign registers at trailheads. We know that not everybody signs those registers, so we had to make an estimate based on the information we had as to what we thought was realistic. Similarly, we have good information on people who camp, and we pulled all that information together, made some assumptions, and we were able to come up with some good numbers on Catskill Park. I mentioned Delaware Ski Facility. I'm talking about that because that's also a state-owned facility. It's on Forest Preserve land. And what we had in that case is we were fortunate that there was a study done in 2012 which used information from New York State and also made some estimates for some of the operational spending. And they used the same kind of models. They used the MGM models that we're using for this study. So we basically took their information and piggybacked it into this, so we were both consistent and using kind of the same database there. Then we looked at for the watershed area. The watershed does not, lands do not track visitors, but they had very good survey information from access permit renewals. So we used that to extrapolate numbers based on how many times they said they visited different areas and so forth, and that gave us what we thought were reasonable estimates for the activities in the watershed, particularly on areas that require permits, which are primarily fishing, hunting, and boating activities. And then for fishing and hunting, New York State does surveys like a New York State Angler Survey. They do what are called surveys of hunter effort. In other words, how many days people are out hunting deer, how many days are out hunting turkey, small game. So that gave us some information there for different regions. We didn't have anything on bears, so I can't tell you too much about that. But by having information for a particular area and how many people hunt in that particular area and how many days they hunt, they gave us some pretty good information. Then we had to kind of size it up to match the geography that we're talking about and then try to avoid double counting. So if we know that our information for the protected areas in the watershed included hunters, we had to try to back out the number of people that we thought were hunting on those lands so that we weren't counting the people twice. But again, we were able to come up with pretty reasonable estimates that we thought reflected the areas that we're studying that dealt with the hunting effort and fishing as well. So that gave us some important information that we could then compare to some of the other information required. And then we looked at other things like cross-country skiing, snowmobiling, whitewater users on the Esopus, usage by private preserves and other parks, scenic rail lines, and other educational facilities and attractions. And for these, we basically contacted the different organizations at different sites, tried to gather as much information as we could, and try to come up with reasonable estimates for those. And then finally, we worked, as I mentioned, with DEC and DEP to put together estimates of spending in the local communities related to their operational activities and investments they've made in infrastructure. Very significant numbers, a lot of people employed by these organizations. Unfortunately, for the most part, information isn't tracked specifically to the Catskills and specific to how much is spent local. So the good news is we're able to get some information. I think we all kind of agreed that it was a little sketchy. So we have to take that into account in developing the estimates that we came up with. So we pulled all that information together, and then we kind of did a sanity check on it. First, we came up with an estimate that we used the number of 5% for folks staying in hotels generally. We know that for the skiing areas, the number is significantly higher than that. We know some people stay in hotels. We don't have a great feel for what percentage. We had some other studies that were done, so we kind of estimated what we thought was a very conservative number to say that of all the people that come to the Catskills for most activities, 5% will stay in a hotel. Then we did a sanity check on all of our other numbers. So, for example, we compared grouse hunting numbers to deer hunting, and our expectation was there were a lot more people coming and doing deer hunting than there were grouse hunting, and if that was the case, we thought, well, that's a good sign that that's what our numbers showed. So we did a lot of comparisons like that, just to see if the numbers seemed to make sense. We made some adjustments where necessary, and then we came up with totals where we totaled things for the public lands, and then for the total that includes the private lands as well. We also did some similar, sanity checks with respect to estimates of spending, compared the spending of people who went to ski areas to the rest of the folks. Then we compared those numbers to other studies that had been done statewide and locally, and found that our numbers looked like this amount of money that we were estimating that people were spending made some sense. So given that we thought we had total number of visitors that made sense, given that we thought that the amount of spending that were estimated made sense, we thought that the garbage in, garbage out, theoretically, good information in gives you good information out. So that was our hope. So our conclusion was that the estimates for our visitor numbers and spending were reasonable and justifiable. Again, kind of a conservative view that we could stand behind the numbers that we came up with. We also said, I use the word here, that our estimates for the operation side of things were a little bit what I'll call speculative. In other words, more like guesses than, and we want them to be ideally. And to me, the most impressive thing about this is we really came up with the first comprehensive estimate of outdoor recreation visitors to Catskills. So we have a grand total here, which I don't think has ever been done before. So the results are, stay tuned. And I think it's the same goes, I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you, but more realistically, if I told you, I think Alan would have to kill me, and either way, we don't want to go there. So we're gonna be coming up with, we're going to be finalizing our, both the total numbers that we're coming up with and our examination of some of these unrealized or undeveloped recreation opportunities with the hopes of releasing results in early 2013. And from that, I think that there's a hope that there'll be some further study, to maybe answer some of the questions that we weren't able to answer in this study, or to follow up on some of the things we uncovered with the hope that we can learn even more. So that's a quick summary of what we've been doing here. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Yes?
Many of us have read a draft version of some of your quick and dirty totaling.
Okay, all right.
And what I wanted to ask you was, what do you think are the significant changes between that version and what you are eventually going to come up with? What do you think? What do you think?
I guess if I knew that, I wouldn't need to do a final version.
Where do you think, from the basis of you seem to take a real common sense approach, where do you think, now that you're getting more and more familiar with the data, what do you think your biases, the biases of your methodology are?
Well, I'm going to try to answer your question. It depends which version. If you saw the most recent draft, I guess I'm looking for further input from the sponsoring organization, so obviously that will be a paramount input to take into account. But I'm hopeful that in terms of the actual numbers that we came up with, the number of visitors and so forth, my thinking is that the numbers are pretty good right now in terms of the total number of visitors that we came up with and things of that nature. I feel pretty good about those right now. I could, if somebody knows something I don't, then obviously we want to take that into account. But I think in terms of the total number of visitors, which is the biggest challenging piece to come together, I think we're in pretty good shape on that. I hope.
One area which we've discussed as kind of important, but hard to judge, is that visitors range from the one-time pass-through tripper to the second homer, who often spends as much time here as in their first home. And the impact on the marketplace is very difficult to assess. There also the non-marketing aspect is very important too, in that sometimes these people like to be here more than we do.
Well, I think those are really good questions, but they're probably in both cases a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here.
Okay.
Because, and I know that, go ahead.
With one exception, I mean, you know, Getty's asking one of the questions that I think that we're starting to struggle with in terms of, we have this classic idea that tourism is someone that comes and visits. And one of the things, when you look at a community that's made up 70% of second home or part-time residents, whether or not we define that as tourism impact or how we quantify that, it's pretty clear that a bunch of those people chose the Catskills because of some of the public land, and they are using the public land to varying degrees. And so, is that tourism impact, or what is that? And I think that's, when you have an area that's impacted as much as ours is, in terms of some of our communities are actually in the 80% range of the parcels in the town are owned by non-full-time residents. So this is something that we will struggle with, and this could be a bias just in the way we think about the word tourism.
Yeah. And, you know, and then you get into a lot of tricky questions here, because if somebody has a home, are they having, this model estimates the impact of somebody who's staying in a hotel. It doesn't necessarily, if I go and buy the house, that's not really reflected in this model. So that may be a little bit of a weakness of the model, because obviously if somebody goes to the effort of buying a house, that's even more impactful potentially than staying in a hotel for a night.
When I take your model,
yeah.
and it certainly seems commonsensical, and assume that you've sort of balanced off the biases within the studies, that is, the tourism people like to talk, to make their economic impact of what they do more important than it is. On the other hand, there's some things that are not captured in many models, and therefore you're hoping that the overestimates, the underestimates cancel out.
Sure. But I would admit, I think to Alan's point, the model that we use does not value, per se, the impact of somebody spending $300,000 on the house. That's not reflected in that particular model. Right, so I think that's an important thing, you know, to maybe talk about. And you know, one of the things, I don't know if you read the last version, and again, I'm getting a little bit outside the scope here, but one of the things that was just mentioned a little bit in the last version that I did was, you know, to what extent are people attracted for economic, to say start a business, because they want to be in an area that has access to recreational activities. So, you know, what kinds of things can we do to leverage the great recreational activities of the Catskills to attract, let's say, technology workers who can work anywhere because of the internet, but they want to be in the Catskills. They like to ski, they like to hike, they like to hunt, they like to do all the kind of things that they can do right out their back door if they live up here. So, you know, how does that, to Alan's point, how do those opportunities, which are based on the public lands and the public investment in those lands, how do those impact the economy in terms of people being attracted to the area for those purposes?
This county has a $4 billion gross product. And the numbers that you're dealing with are a very small part of it. It's tiny.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word tiny. You know, there's a lot of different factors that make up that $4 billion. And there aren't too many of them that are bigger than this one. That would be the way I would.
You think? Okay.
Well, individually. I mean, if you look at, you know, what are the things that impact it, there's, you know, different industries, there's individual factories and so forth, but if you look at the number of jobs and the total dollars impacted, there aren't, I mean, again, I mentioned I was on the county legislature in the Albany area. If somebody was opening up a pizza place that had 5 jobs, we'd be out there, cutting the ribbon and getting a picture taken. Whereas, you're talking about hundreds of jobs that are supported in this community for outdoor recreation. So, we make a big deal about 5 jobs, and we're talking about hundreds of jobs here. So I would argue about the term tiny.
Okay, well, clearly there are, DEP and DEC are major employers, as you
Absolutely.
The quality of jobs are also, of course, very important in determining value added is important.
Yep.
And somehow we have to calculate whether public investment in trying to become more successful at tourism is a better investment than than dollars spent somewhere else.
And I would even add to that, which is that there are you could be talking about tourism for ski areas, you could be talking about tourism for hunting. There's a lot of different activities because the Catskill has such a diverse variety of activities. Which ones do you focus on and where do you focus on and so forth. So, you're asking a lot of questions which, I don't think we have all the answers quite yet. So.
Well, and I think as Brian said, and let's do questions and answers in a bit. But I think as Brian said, this is one of the first comprehensive looks at this sector in the Catskills, and it's almost like a stock and trade for any good consulting firm to raise more questions than the answer. But other than that, I think
that's a compliment.
But other than that, I think we're in the starting process for the conversation. So let's talk about what some of the next steps in this process are. And Brian's work is not quite done, but we can give you a sense of the magnitude of this in terms of we will be releasing final results within a couple weeks. And when I saw the preliminary numbers, my reaction wasn't tiny. My reaction is, well, that's bigger than I thought it was. So, we're going to have an interesting conversation with this. As we get into this, the question... Okay. The question really is, we're about to put a number on the table here for the next couple of weeks. And we'll all look at that number and say, what does that mean? Right? So, let's say, just for the sake of information, let's say the number is $50 million a year. And the visitors are just under 2 million a year. What does that mean? Bill, are those big numbers or little numbers?
Yeah, I'd say those are big for this region. But.
Well, if we're starting with subject matter, that the one thing we've never done this before, we have a lot of people in the Catskills that are of the perspective that the public land actually holds back our economy.
Yeah, right.
I think that is, that's a pretty common perspective. I've been to public constituency meetings where I've heard the public complain to our state legislators that if it wasn't for that Catskill Park or that darn New York City watershed, we'd have a vibrant community.
Right.
So this is important where we've never really taken a step to say, okay, but let's look at what it does now. Because then, as we go forward, there's some additional questions asked. And the first thing that I ask, so I've basically taken the green is New York State, the oranges and browns are New York City. So on a landscape basis, if you put together Bill's presentation and Paul's presentation, and you back up and look at it spatially, this is what the Catskills is. We have a lot of protected land. We have 2 major landowners, and the question is, if the impact is around 50 million a year, and there are 1.7 million users, the next step for us is to say, what would it take to grow that? What would it take to make a bigger impact? And you're right, Gabby, there's probably some bigger fish, in other sectors of the economy, but this is a sector that we care about. And so can we make it more responsive? The first thing when I look at this map, I scratch my head. How would you make this function? Right? It's a little bit spread out. It's a little bit disconnected. We have, 2 landowners that are, frankly, in the last 5 years, have started working more closely together, and I think that's very promising. but there's some challenges to making this function as an asset. If it was a private corporation that had invested that much money in an asset. So let's say that, you know, compare the management of this public park to other parks, Disney World or any of those. They have an advertising budget. They have a long-term strategic plan on how to make their assets function. Do we have that here? You know, Bill mentioned some plans. We've got some plans. New York City is doing some planning. But as a region, there is a huge impact here. And so we've got to figure out, you know, what do we do with it? So Bill mentioned we got a public access plan. What he didn't tell you is it was written in 1999, and most of the recommendations in that plan are still current today in terms of things we still need to do. We've got some groups starting to think about rebranding the Catskills in terms of, you know, I think there's a perception that we've kind of maybe lost our niche in the tourism trade. And let's face it, tourism is a very competitive business, and there's a perception that we've got an awful lot of tourists, like, you know, a 25 million metropolitan population that in some cases drive past us on the thruway to get to places that are open for tourism, like the Adirondacks of Vermont. But they're driving by us to get there. And so do we have a comprehensive thought on how we get our share of those 25 million people? Some of the things that are, I think, really exciting is we have opened 3 additional reservoirs for boating and sailing. And now we have to figure out how do we make that resource function. In terms of, yes, we opened it and we were relatively encouraged. There was, you know, a few hundred people that used a bunch of the reservoirs. That's probably not all it could be. So, you know, we're going to release this study, and our deliberate intent in releasing these numbers is to start a long-term conversation about how to turn this asset into one that's more valuable economically. We've made some progress on a bunch of things, and a few years ago, I think we identified a few years ago that if you really knew where the boundaries were, you could tell when you were in the park. But other than that, it was a little tough. There was a bunch of signs that said you entered the park, very few signs that said you left the park, but there wasn't really a cohesive sense of the park. So one of the things we're starting to do is we've got a signage program for the logo, so people start to identify, you know, you're in a special place. New York State DEC and DOT have the highest degree of cooperation I've seen in a long time in starting to figure out, can we help the public identify the resources that are available to them? And it's going up. I don't know how far we've gotten with this bill, but I'm starting to see a lot of them, and it's encouraging. Like, okay, you know, this is one of the hidden treasures of the Catskills from my perspective. There was never a sign on Route 28 to say where it was until this fall.
Yep.
So next steps, we're going to release this study. We're going to start working on an interpretive center concept, and Bill has been one of the leaders in this. This is a rendering from one of the students at Delhi. This may be one of the ones that we look at as the way to go. But after many, many years of recognizing that without good interpretation of this resource, that we're not doing our job in promoting it, we're going to start with a modest building, and I think we're on track to break ground in 2013 on the first phase of the interpretive center. We've had some discussion about creating an app for the Catskills. So, for example, if you go to Maui and you want to visit Maui, the first thing you do is you buy the app, and you can figure out every recreational resource and everything that you could do to have fun in Maui. We're talking about doing that. There's a bunch of partners that are going to get together and fundraise to do that. I think the long-term issue, from my perspective, is to get all the resources together and start to look at, so for example, we've got 500 people on the Papacton boats. What would be a good number? What's the plan? How do we promote it? You know, if I said to DEC, you know, these are impressive figures. 300,000 acres of preserve, 300 miles of trails. I don't think if we survey our users, they're going to say it's overused. I think it has capacity to handle more people. And if we're going to have that conversation, a regional tourism plan for these natural resources would be, you know, how do we advertise it? How do we promote it? How do we build it? How do we get more economic impact? And it may be one of the things we're going to look at it is, can we get more overnight use? Because as Brian said, that's a way to grow the resource without growing a lot more people. So from my perspective, as we move forward, I think we need to get the stakeholders to sit around the table and say, here's the baseline that Brian has provided us. Is it a big number? Is it a little number? So let's say, for the sake of conversation, that it is presently estimated around 50 million a year. 10% growth would have a pretty big economic impact in some of these communities, especially a community that looks at the negative side of it, in terms of we have 80% of the land in the town of Shandaken that's owned by the state of the city. So can we show them some growth on the use? And that's what I'm saying. If we start to put the pieces together, we do interpretation at the gateways to the park, we do better promotion. If I said to Bill, what's your promotion budget for the preserve? And he's going to laugh, right? Because we don't have the access to that funding right now. But maybe what we ought to be doing is making a case to our state legislature that we're in an area that's impacted by public land, but we want to make some lemonade. And I think that's the stage that we're at. So those are next steps. And I guess it would be fair to say that we consider this study to be step number one. There's going to be a lot of publicity on those results, and we're going to try to steer that towards the next step, which is having more comprehensive recreational planning. Let's open up for questions.
I know a couple of people raised their hand before they had questions.
I had a question for Brian.
I guess that's allowed.
Yeah, I'm just curious how if you could give us a little more insight as to how you came up with the 5% that stay overnight, and how that. And I'm more interested in how that compares to other regions like the Shwangungs or the Adirondacks.
Yeah, I don't think there was a lot of magic in that. I think what we did was we looked at other types of uses and other types of areas. So we know, for example, for skiing, people who go skiing typically are morning to dark, dawn to dark kind of activity, so they're more likely to be staying in a hotel. We looked at other surveys that have been done around New York State and in the area, and 5% we thought was kind of the lowest number that was bigger than zero. So we wanted to use something conservative, and we knew it was less than some of the more higher-end uses, or the folks who spent more money. So we kind of settled on 5% as a conservative number. So again, not so much magic in the number, but just trying to come up with something that was both reasonable and conservative.
Yeah, and that's a really big number to get accurate because of the multiplier effect.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's going to be clear as we start to look at this public resource and plan how to make it perform is we'll probably need better information than some of our estimates. So I have a sense that there's some surveying that's going to have to be done. We didn't ask Brian to survey in this first phase because we wanted to get a starting baseline. But to improve that and to plan, he said, I think you said it was primary research was the term you used?
Yeah, and it's expensive research. If when you start doing surveys and stuff, it's a lot of man hours that go into that, a lot of time that goes into it. So, for a budget, you have to have a bigger budget to put that kind of information together. And again, you've got so many different activities in the Catskills that it's a big undertaking to really try to come up with that.
Right. The other multiplier on this is if you look at skiing, when we release this result in the report, when you look at the impact of skiing in terms of the dollars and number of visitors, it's a huge piece. And then, the real question is, could we do some surveying of those people to see what percentage of them are staying or would like to stay?
And there is some information, and actually for the skiers, and that's one of the reasons why I think I have a reasonable confidence in the numbers, is because the ski areas, again, because the impact is big for them, they actually go out and do a lot of the surveys. So they had, we had some pretty good information from a reliable source on that. I think where it's tricky is when you have, cross-country skiers or hikers or folks who are, day users and so forth. There's just so many, disparate uses and folks coming from all over that we don't have as good a handle on to know whether it's 5% or 4% or 10% they're staying in
Yeah,
hotels.
and believe me, intuitively, I would say it's like you said, you probably want to go with a number pretty close to 0 because it doesn't seem like many people spend the night here other than second homeowners. But I am curious if you could, I don't mean to push on this too hard, but do we have a number that's commonly used in the Adirondacks or some of the other areas of the state that we could sort of get a sense how we compare to right now?
I think we did a survey. There was a survey done of the Shangung area, which I was involved with.
Right.
And they had done a survey, and I think it was around 5% for that. And that was one of the. I mean, that's fairly close by.
Yep.
You've got kind of a similar group of folks coming from similar areas, so I think using the 5% here and there kind of makes some sense.
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
I think we're low. I think we're very low compared to other areas personally.
Yeah,
That's
well, it might be less than 5%, but you know, it can't be too much less.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's happening too is with skiing, like I think a lot of people that are skiing at Bel Air are probably staying somewhere, but it's probably Kingston or beyond.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's a little tough to capture.
Yep.
When you think of the Hamptons, another exurban recreation destination, do you think of the recreational activities? No, of course not. You know, how many people go swim? You know, it's probably a point of pride that they don't swim, you know, and don't fish, you know, whatever. But there is, it's the general culture is what builds the economy. And it's really a combination, not just of outdoor places that you click numbers, but of the interactions, of the involvement of other types of activities. Because I suspect there's more value added by 3 Wall Street tycoons meeting on the beach and plotting, you know, what's going to happen, what they're going to do, than there is from, you know, the entire recreational thing. And by saying that recreation is a small part of the pie, I'm not arguing that we should ignore it or that we shouldn't develop it, but just saying that the larger piece, you know, the internet connections, the circles of professional people in various business services, etc., second home value, those things are what we need to get more focus on, because I think that's more the key to what we need to find out. I think that what Brian has done is a wonderful start and very important, and I think I admire his method. I think he's probably pretty accurate on his numbers, but I think we need to look not just at that tree, but at the whole forest.
I don't think we're going to represent, you know, that recreational tourism is the whole economy by any means, but it's clearly one that given the resources we have to figure out. And I'm going to, you know, this is an interesting anecdote. I showed you the sketch by one of the Dell High students. We took them to the Interpretive Center site, and while we were there, it was pretty clear that of the 20 students involved in this project, not one of them had ever been on Forest Preserve. And they're going to school at Delhi.
Yeah.
So, you know, what I'm saying is I don't think we've done a good job of making this resource work for us. And you know, if you can't answer the question, whose job is it to promote that opportunity, it doesn't happen. And I see very little recognition that it's not DEP's job to promote their public access. They do it somewhat, but it's passive. DEC, they own 300,000 acres, and if you say, what are you doing to promote it? They've got some maps, and I'm not being critical, but any time you ask the question, whose job is it to advertise and promote and grow this resource, and no one can say it's my job, it doesn't happen. I think that's one of the things that happens in the Catskills. It's not happening. I mean, 0 for 20 on those students. And they're 45 minutes away. Delia, did you want to ask?
I just had,
Delia?
well, I don't know how to get it through, but my thought has always been, at what point do you spoil what we have by bringing, you know, by what we're doing? Because this, and I'm for all the things, but I also know why people have come here forever and why they move in, you know, they come and they stay. And I think there's a fine line of spoiling.
There's a balance.
I know that the people involved here are going to be sure to keep the balance, right? I think it's really important. And I also know what the locals want. They want a Walmart on 28, you know, where the fruit stand is. So that's another part of the whole thing.
George, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just kind of keep going from what everyone else has said about the towns and the nature that it's more of a culture. Like when you look at Phoenicia or you look at Hunter, like on a weekend or in the summertime, there's a lot of people there. Now, how many of the people are there because the restaurants and the ambiance? But how much of that is also connected to the fact that it's nestled, surrounded by the Forest Preserve? And so that's one point, and then there's the connections that you were talking about. So I just thought that was a great point that you made.
John?
Brian, I was just curious if your study includes the property taxes that the DEC is paying to the municipalities, and if it includes DEP monies going into the, that might be going in, I'm not sure that are going into
The short answer is no. It includes operation spending into the local economy. It does include sales tax revenue. So if there is spending at restaurants or light tourists, then we can estimate the sales tax revenue from that.
Because $11 million a year in 4 counties, that's
Yep.
very small.
Right.
The interesting discussion of second homeowners and how that's not incorporated into this particular study, but it seems that that would be one of the main places where people stay overnight, is with their friends that have houses up here in the country. Same thing with the Hamptons, you know. One of the great things of having a house in the Hamptons is your friends will come out and stay over for the weekend and go to the parties or whatever, you know. So that's a factor, I think, that could be looked at.
And I think two pieces to that. There has been a study that was done, I think it was by one of the local chambers, that looked at second home owners. When I talked to somebody a while back, it hadn't been finished yet, but it may be completed now. And second thing is, one of the things that you could do if you wanted to do surveys is survey folks as to find out where they were staying, and the models that we use could calculate the difference or the additional benefit of folks staying with second homeowners if that's indeed where they're staying, right? The work that we did for this didn't distinguish between folks who might be staying in their own house or in somebody else's house that they know and so forth. It really looked at just, are they spending $100 on a hotel, or are they not spending $100 on a hotel? So we were a little bit more simplistic just because we didn't have that level of specificity in the information. But again, if you did surveys, that's the kind of thing, as Alan said, in terms of next steps here, that's something you could do some more.
Seems like it would only ramp up the results, the total numbers, if that was also included.
Yeah, and again, I think the important thing that when you do an initial study like this, you want to have something that people aren't going to shoot down right out of the box. Oh, you're way over, your numbers are overestimated, and so forth. So we wanted to come up with something that we thought was very reasonable, that we could justify, and that was conservative enough so somebody wouldn't throw us under the bus before we even get started.
I think there's probably a significant number of people that chose their primary residence here because it's an area that has a significant amount of protected land. In terms of, and I'm one of those people where, I was living in Sullivan County and saw a development wave come through. And it's like, I'm not sure I really want to be part of that. So you start looking for a place where you have a little bit more buffer from that kind of huge change. And in the central Catskills with 159,000 acres of city land and 300,000 acres of state land. You know, you can get some development, but not the kind of wave we saw go through Orange County and Sullivan County in the 80s and 90s.
Brian, it's probably a trivial thing, but I do a lot of hiking, and I can't help but notice that the vehicles in the parking lots that we're talking about oftentimes have out-of-state licenses, oftentimes they're rental cars. It seems to me there's quite a reservoir of information there. It wouldn't be that hard to tap. I don't know.
No, it certainly could be done. It could be done. I think, again, that the scope of what we did here didn't include that. And again, it's, there's, to do it well, it does require a certain amount of man hours, and that's not really the stuff I do per se, but I certainly work with folks who do that kind of work, and it is, you know, it's another investment in terms of information to collect, but, you know, that would answer, give a Bill's question a little bit better in terms of where those folks are coming from.
But I think as we start to figure out how to better enhance and understand our economy, there's a fair amount that we're going to find out we don't know. In terms of, I agree with you, Sam. I see a lot of yellow license plates on Saturdays and Sundays. And the question
is shocked at how few locals are out there.
Yeah, I noticed that myself.
And the question is, are they have a residence? Are they staying in a hotel? Are they up for the day? We don't know the answer to that. We seem to be struck by the number of those plates on a Saturday and Sunday in the Catskills. And it starts to get us to ask some questions about, you know, do we really understand what makes this economy tick?
The other thing I think you probably want to speak to, Alan, and that is, who do you anticipate will use this information? It seems to me that, you know, it's all great for the general public to, you know, to appreciate, like you mentioned in Shandaken, they need to understand it. But as far as making any decisions about, you know, enhancing this resource, which I think you were alluding to, well, I'm not sure who you're going to tell that's going to be in a position to do that, and that's kind of where I was wondering. I thought
one element of this is as we start to document that this is a big part of what the Catskills is, and this is the baseline, and we'd like to grow it. We're starting to gather a systematic set of data that we can go to foundations and grant sources and say, we need to do some more planning, we need to do some more study, we need to understand what, you know, how to make this function better. And the first thing you have to do is you have to have that baseline. So, you know, I think funding sources are one of the audiences for this. I think our elected officials don't understand, you know, this. We have a lot of local elected officials in the Catskills that really, you know, their solution to, you know, the economic challenges is, you know, let's get permission to get rid of Article 14. Let's start cutting some trees. And clearly those people, you know, they have a perspective, but we've never told them the other side of Article 14 in terms of, let's say that because of Article 14, we do have $50 million of economic impact. We've never told that story. And so, you know, there's got to be a greater recognition that we have this resource, we need to grow it, and so the audiences are kind of varied, but I really think, you know, we're getting ready to start doing some awareness of the Catskill Park in Albany with our delegation. These are numbers that we need to have with us in terms of this is what it is today, this is what we think it could become.
I know it's kind of abstract, but, you know, at some point you're going to need to talk about ecosystem services. In other words, we just blithely say we're providing water for 9 million people. We're just, you know, we don't charge a thing for the clean air. I mean, you say, why do people like to live here? Well, I worked in Newburgh and I drove way the heck up here. Why is that? Because I like to breathe clean air. And I think those are services that we need to put a number on too, because
It's hard to put a number on.
Yeah, right.
That's very abstract. That's what I said. It's somewhat more abstract.
Right.
But as soon as we start getting people to pay for some of these, or at least understand that they have value, the better off we're going to be. I think.
You know, and let's take another example. If you look at that map I showed where things aren't very connected, you know, I think the Catskill Forest Preserve is unfinished. there are key pieces that need to be added either by the city or the state or both, so that we can make this resource more comprehensive and from an ecological standpoint more effective. It's really clear right now that when you start talking about a new addition to the preserve, and this is true of both the Adirondacks and the Catskills, people are starting to push back. And I think that's because we haven't really talked about, the value of it. And so, this is also a little bit proactive on our part to say, let's build a case for the preserve, because, we're about to have a constitutional discussion in New York State. And as soon as you start to have that conversation, the topic of Article 14 comes up. Should we amend Article 14 in a really big way? If we haven't defensively created a case for what it's doing, we're going to have a really tough time in that conversation. And I don't think that's unrealistic to think that we may get in that conversation within the next couple of years.
I hate to tell you the conversation got here. Why don't they allow us on there to cut that tree? That's ridiculous for them to have that. I mean, all the time.
Sure.
Everybody says it's ridiculous for them to not let people on the land
Why
cut
can't
the trees.
why can't we tap the trees for maple syrup? What up with that?
But the other thing is, you talk to a technician in the hospital or something, if you're, where do you live? Oh, someday I'm going to go out there. Kingston doesn't. We're talking about getting tourists up here. Kingston doesn't even know they think we're out there in those mountains. They're scared. And they spend money if they come out for lunch or they do like it, but they don't dare do it. So how do you advertise to just local people?
We have one of the board members of the Catskill Center is a faculty member that specializes in international tourism. And one of the things that she's told us is one aspect of what we're missing in terms of the next step here is let's identify some gaps to grow this. And one gap that we have is so much of the 300 miles of trails that we have in the preserve are really based on a more advanced comfort level, right, and a more advanced hiker than the beginning level hiker. And so she said one of the things we're missing are those soft entries where you have a short loop trail like what Paul was talking about with some interpretation, so people can go and get an introduction and the confidence that they can then strike out on their own and do one of the 300 miles. And so, one of the things that she said is we're missing the beginner level, and so what you're not doing is you're not growing the next generation of participants. And so, you look at the hiking data, for 10 years it's relatively flat. We need to start thinking constructively about how to do more. And I think her recommendation is a good one. We've got to look at some entry-level, beginning-level opportunities to get people to come here and start using this resource.
Another thing I'll speak to, and Bill has to listen, but I miss the forest rangers. I don't need any more environmental enforcement officers. What I need is the forest. I don't know about Smokey, but I need those people who are out there interpreting, guiding, understanding, and not sitting in their trucks with big guns. And it really is it's a missing piece, and I see it going less and less and less, and more environmental enforcement officers, and fewer real forest rangers.
The people that get the experience of meeting a forest ranger in the preserve, that's a real highlight of the experience because they're ambassadors on site. And how do we go to Albany to do the advocacy for this preserve without the kind of numbers that we're trying to figure out now? And I think that's the question that we're struggling with. And so, admittedly, this is a modest study, it's a starting point, but, if we can go to our state assemblymen and state senators and say, this is important to us and here's why, we start to make that case. And, let's face it, with DEC Region 3, 150,000 acres of forest preserve up until this year, they had 3/10 of an FTE in forestry managing 150,000 acres. We let that happen in terms of 3/10 of an FTE made up of 2 different people. You basically have no foresters helping us plan and implement this resource. And we haven't gone to Albany and said, no, you can't cut that because it's important to our economy. That's what we need to do. All right, thank you for coming, folks.